Good morning, Eamon and Isabel. Well, welcome to Ash Farm in Buckinghamshire and welcome to Richard Heady. You are an arable farmer and also, as you can probably see just behind us, we are surrounded by a lovely bunch of cows because you are also a beef farmer. And what we are talking about is the war in Ukraine and the situation that is placing pressure on to UK farmers. And now there are essentially two problems. Firstly, fuel and fertilizer, and secondly to do with grain. Now, we'll come on and we'll discuss this a little bit more, but just to give you a brief overview, Russia is one of the world's largest exporters of fertilizer, but Moscow has been sanctioned against by the world, and therefore exports have been disrupted from the country, and prices as a result have skyrocketed as farmers look for other sources. And secondly, grain. We have that Russia and Ukraine are producing the largest amount of grain probably around that in the world. They account for 30% actually of the world's exports of wheat. And the problem with this is that Ukrainian farmers are normally planting crops for next year's harvest, but of course the men there are taking up arms. Many women and children have now fled the country as refugees. So this is of course going to have a big dent on global food supplies. But let's bring in Richard. Richard, what are you seeing at the moment and how is this affecting you? Let's start with fertilizer. Are you having to minimise or reduce the amount of fertilizer that you use to try to sort of perhaps save some for next year?
Yeah, we're having to be really careful of how we use it. So we bought some early at a cheaper price, which we were really lucky to do. But it's skyrocketed since then. The price of fertiliser has about tripled. So we're having to be really careful. So we've changed things we're growing. We're growing a few more beans, which helps because that doesn't need the nitrogen. But we do need the nitrogen for our wheat. If we don't put the nitrogen on, we won't get the quantity of yield, but we won't get the quality. And we need the quality so that we can make bread with it rather than just feed it to animals.
Because that's the thing as well, because of course we are standing here in a cattle shed. Of course you've got your beef here. There's perhaps maybe a conundrum between whether you produce this for bread or whether you feed it to your cows. How are you dealing with this?
Well, the cattle can finish off grass. It takes a bit longer, so you know we don't get the return on our capital quite so quick. But we can just feed them on grass, and that might be the option going forward. We just leave them on the grass. They finish a bit slower, but then we use the grain to sell to make food for us, because I think there's going to be a world shortage of grain and feeding humans has to come first. Well,
that's another thing I wanted to ask you about. How do you foresee this potential dent in global food supplies because of the situation in Ukraine, because farmers cannot plant their crop for next year? How do you see that affecting you here in the UK?
Well, it's going to have some benefits. It's pushed the price right up. So these are the highest prices I've ever seen for wheat at the minute. And luckily, we've got some in store to sell. So that's worked out well for us. We don't want to profiteer from a terrible situation. I think the thing is, if prices continue to be high, it's the poorest families that are really going to struggle in this country, but also the poorest countries throughout the world are going to struggle to afford this grain and feed themselves.
Thank you, Richard. Well, we've got a little bit more movement from the cows behind us. I don't think they quite anticipated us to be walking into their bedroom first thing this morning. Thank you, Richard. I think it's clear to see that the war in Ukraine is going to continue to have a knock-on effect on those global food supply chains.